Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Loud and Clear LinkedIn Live, and today also on Facebook. My wonderful guest today, who is from Microsoft, is Adina Hajej. Unfortunately, my second guest, Sujud Abu Atta, is unwell and she's unable to join us, but we do have the great pleasure of Adina Hajej joining us. Adina is the Principal Product Manager at Microsoft, and she's also very involved with the Women's Employee Resource Group. So Adina, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's so exciting to be here with you, Helen. As I've told you before, I lurk after you on LinkedIn, and it's wonderful to be here with you today.
Well, I'm so thrilled that you were willing and able to join us today. It's really wonderful. So, Adina, I'm going to just straight away roll out with Adina. How did you come to be one of the co-leaders of the Women's Employee Resource Group at Microsoft?
So I have often been involved in helping people from communities who are underrepresented. I was involved in a nonprofit called Olim Biyachad, founded by Yifat Ovadia, that helped people from the Ethiopian community find equitable employment. And I've had mentors from all different kinds of communities. When Microsoft Israel, in the wake of Microsoft, really all of Microsoft, wanted to make a broader statement about diversity and inclusion, Ariella Shina, the head of HR, and Karen Khan approached me and asked if I would be willing to lead this Women's Employee Resource Group. It was our first more official foray into a structured approach to diversity and inclusion in Microsoft Israel. So that's how I got involved, and together with my co-chair, Moran Chaviv, we've been pushing forward on this. And we partner with all of the other ERGs in Microsoft Israel. So it's really been an exciting time to be engaged in this.
Beautiful. So what I hear, Adina, is that you brought a pre-existing commitment to the values of inclusion. In fact, you were involved in an additional forum beforehand, and you brought that perspective and understanding and commitment, in fact, to a highly marginalized sector in Israeli society, and brought that consciousness with you to the forum, the Employee Resource Group, of which you co-lead with Moran Weber at Microsoft. So you also mentioned that two people in HR contacted you and said, we want you to be involved in leading this. So that leads me to another big question, which is often discussed on LinkedIn, which is it more important top down or bottom up? So when you say representatives of HR, that means that the internal structure of Microsoft said, we're committed to this value. In fact, we want your help. We're going to recruit people to drive it forward. How can you give us a sense of your perspective on the bottom up, top down question?
Yeah, so I think it's a combination of both. At Microsoft, every single employee has a commitment, a written objective to do something to improve diversity and inclusion, to make this place a more diverse and inclusive environment that will influence our ecosystem and our world. So that is something that is, it's a requirement. Having said that, each of us at Microsoft bring our passions of how we want to change this world. That's why we're out at Microsoft. We want to make this a better place for everybody. And so it's coming from both directions. What the ERGs do, coming from top down, is it provides us that structure. They are completely voluntary, completely employee-led. I have my day job that I get paid to do, and this is the passion. Recognizing that it's an objective as well, that I realize with a whole bunch of other very committed individuals. And it's not just the women's ERG, of course. Sujud, who we really wish great health, and she should recover quickly, was a representative from the Arab community, the Arab at Microsoft Israel. And she, of course, is a woman. So she brings that identity to the women's ERG. And as an Arab, in part of the Arab community in Israel, she brings that identity as well. We have other employee resource groups in Israel, and each person brings their passion and their identity and their spirit of allyship as they join these different employee resource groups.
Beautiful. So that, of course, gives rise to another question, which is, well, how many are there? How deep does the dive go into intersectionality and different identities at a huge organization like Microsoft?
Yeah, so there are a few pivots to that question. First of all, there's the global pivot, and there's an attention to communities that are common across the world, universal communities. Women are women everywhere. The Galeem community, the LGBTQI plus community, it's a reality everywhere, and it's generally an underrepresented community. And then the disability ERG, again, there are people who have different kinds of or varying abilities that we want to make sure are recognized and have the appropriate inclusive behavior. And then there are the different localized communities. For example, in America, of course, there's the Blacks at Microsoft community, which is not as prevalent here in Israel. In Israel, we have the Orthodox Jews at Microsoft community to recognize the diverse needs of the Haredi and the modern Orthodox communities. And we also, of course, have the Arabs at Microsoft to recognize that diverse, underrepresented population.
Thank you so much. So what I hear is there's recognition of diversity, there's a dig down into different identities, and whilst perhaps not every single identity has its own group of particular intersectionality, there's a real attempt to speak to and support the larger groupings of people that we know are everywhere. I was interested to hear you say that there's a written statement for everyone that they have to at least sign off on something about a written commitment to inclusion. I would love it if we could drive this conversation also to the most practical level, because I will share, I have been, as a freelancer, I go to lots of different companies. I've seen wonderful, inspiring statements on many, many, many walls, really beautiful things written on many walls, also written beautifully. People have invested in inspiring artwork. But the values that I witness being carried out in those same spaces are not congruent with what's beautifully written on all those beautiful walls. So beyond a written commitment, which could be lip service, Adina, tell me, how does Microsoft, I don't know about you, I'm not putting it all on you, how does one create greater inclusion? How do you hard bake inclusion into things like the job description that goes out when you're recruiting, into the interview process, into how meetings are run? I'm interested in the nitty gritty, bitty, itsy bitsy stuff, and less what's written. Forgive me.
No, that's wonderful. And I totally agree with you, because it's very easy to fake it. There is an element of faking it till you make it that is also important. And I want to talk about that too, because remind me if I don't say it again, the allyship piece, because that's an important piece.
Okay, good.
First of all, everyone at Microsoft is educated, and we have training commitments around diversity. We have courses on covering, on authenticity, on the different underrepresented communities. We are encouraged, that's requirements. We're also encouraged to take part in different conversations from leaders of the different communities, from representatives of the different communities, hearing about, sitting next to somebody from the ultra-Orthodox community, talking to somebody, an activist from the LGBTQ community, sitting with somebody from the Arab community. That brings it to light for us. I could say also there's, if we think about how do you measure diversity inclusion, you could say, well, what's the percentage of these underrepresented populations in Microsoft or at any company That's an interesting measurement, but a much more interesting measurement is how comfortable do I feel talking about my underrepresented identity? Do I feel comfortable saying, hey, I got to get out of here at 4 p.m. to pick up my kids? Or I'm fasting every day because it's Ramadan. Or I need special foods in the kitchen. All of that is recognized in Microsoft, certainly in Microsoft Israel and in Microsoft around the world, where there are prayer rooms where we get a kind of playbook on how to treat our colleagues with respect as they go through 40 days of fasting, how to think about how there might be special utensils in a kitchen because there are different levels of kashrut that people want to respect. And all of that is ingrained into our behavior. And then there's the microaggressions. And this is something that I've seen change over my years at Microsoft with the last 5 to 7 years of attention. The things like, and this can happen to men, of course, but I've seen it predominantly happen to women, where women's voices aren't given an opportunity to speak up, to speak out, where, in a meeting, if they have an idea, and we all are familiar with the mansplaining, and it really did happen, no matter how much men want to say, well, it happens to me too. And it's true that it happens to men. It has happened to women. And I've seen that change, where all of a sudden you see somebody, it's common behavior, in a meeting say, hey, have we heard from everybody, knowing full well that there's a woman, the lone woman in the room, whose voice wasn't heard. So those are some examples of kind of leading by example. And there's another thing. Sujud shared this with me as we were kind of prepping for this. So Sujud, forgive me if I don't represent you 100% accurately, but the minute you're not the only in a room, it makes it much easier. It's a bit of a virtuous cycle. So every company has to invest in getting the first, but the minute they're not the only, it's much easier to be, I'm not the only woman covering my hair. I'm not the only man with payot. I'm not the only Black person in the room.
Yes.
And all of that makes it much easier. And that's something that we, Microsoft definitely pushes for as well.
Yes. Amazing. I really appreciate those concrete steps for inclusion internally, and the measure of that you're speaking about is proportions, and tracking the data, like who's in the room, who's not in the room, what do we look like, but also how comfortable do I feel. And I very much appreciate the reference to the virtuous cycle, when I'm not the only. I worked with a company recently where a particular member of the team shared that she was really tired of being the only Black face whenever there was a team meeting, like a hands-on, all hands team meeting. She said, oh, just lots of women, lots of this, lots of that. But here, I'm the only person of color who is here. And it's like, not simple to be so obviously different. I really appreciate that. All right. You mentioned allyship beforehand. Adina, tell us all a little bit more about that, because I imagine people are watching now and they'll also watch the replay. So I'll just throw out there, you can also add a question later, and I'd love it if you did hashtag replay, just so that both Adina and I know that if you weren't here now, you was here later. That's just fun. So tell us about allyship, please.
Yeah, so this is a concept that we are all at Microsoft trained on. And to be an ally, and it's generally to be an aspiring ally, is to put yourself in the shoes of somebody else and really try to understand deeply their lived experiences. I am not an Arab Muslim. I don't cover my hair. But if I can put myself in the place of an Arab Muslim woman who covers her hair and try to understand the difficulties that she faces potentially in Israel, and I can empathize, or at least start by sympathizing and understanding her story, her lived experience, then I can become an ally to her as she may potentially struggle in the work environment or even outside the work environment. I can say I see that as the leader of the women's ERG. We have, I don't know, maybe some percentage, some high percentage of members of the employee resource group who do not identify as women. And they are there to show support as women, as we grow our careers, as we enter the workforce, the high-tech workforce, as we grow our careers, as we become more and more senior. They're by our side, understanding our lived experiences, not mocking the fact that why are women considered an underrepresented minority, but rather trying to understand some of our struggles and to be there beside us as we struggle together. I mentioned earlier, or as we meet these challenges together, I mentioned earlier the example in the meeting when an ally speaks up and says, has everybody had their voice heard? And when it's a senior ally, even more so.
Oh, yeah.
That's an example of really showing, taking diversity and inclusion to its final step.
So I'd love to dig just a little deeper on that. Let's say that I'm in a room and I'm senior on that team, or even I'm a member of that team. I'm being invited, I have a right to be there. And I see somebody get snubbed, dismissed, their idea overlooked, quoted by somebody else, and this second person gets credit, like all of the markers that we know. What does one say? What can one say? There is like an active discussion around this point. Does one say, not cool, bro? Not cool, sister? Or do we say, I think there was, I loved it when Helen raised that exact same idea. What do you say so you're not being aggressive and you're demonstrating like something happened here, which I'm not okay with?
It really depends on the behavior. The microaggressions, I think that it's demeaning to the person who's suffering from the aggression, the microaggression, to call that out and say, hey, you're not letting Helen talk. That's I don't need your help here. I want you, like, can you make it more elegant? But if somebody says a slur, that's something that has to get called out immediately, or even it's not that far. There's kind of that scale of where you draw the line. I was in a meeting where it wasn't a slur, but it was something very, very close to that. And there was immediate pause and immediate attention to this. This was not in Microsoft Israel. And there was subsequent training that the manager who saw this brought to the team to ensure that everyone was on the same page in terms of how we treat each other with respect. And of course, coming out of that, how we're diverse and inclusive.
Spectacular. I love that you sense it. Like, it's not automatic. I think that's terrific. I think that's really, really practical. And I may write about that later, Adina, as is my want. Beautiful. I want to go back to something that you said earlier about who's in the employee resource groups. Now, for example, there may be people who don't identify as women who are in the employee resource group for women. What's the experience with that? Is it all positive? Does their just being there hamper the conversation, or does that take a while to build trust? I've learned that there are, for example, also some employee resource groups in other businesses where a man will be at the head of, someone who identifies as a man will be at the head of the women's employee resource group. Someone who's white will be at the head of the leader of a person of color employee resource group at a large company. Like, can you unpack that for me? Because from where I sit and the experience that I've had working with groups that are mixed and groups that are not mixed, that are all like employees, like a women's group that's come together for a particular purpose, the experience is chemically different when it's all or mixed.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And there's definitely a networking element to this, that sometimes you want just people who share your identity to be in the room. I could take an extreme example. if there were a Russian speaking community, one of the very attributes of that community would be we speak Russian. If I, as an ally, want to join the community, understand and empathize and all the rest of an aspiring ally, I don't speak Russian. So I, by nature, am going to disrupt their spirit of networking, of connectivity. So without even getting chemical about it, it's just a fact.
Mm.
When Sujit and I talked about this, one of the things she mentioned is the challenge is it's necessary to build trust. If I'm going to have an ally join my ERG, I am a member of the Arabs at Microsoft Israel ERG as an example. Am I a trusted member? Do they feel comfortable having me be part of their community? And the same thing with any of the other LGBT community. I'm also a member of their ERG. Do they feel comfortable having me there, even though I don't identify as lesbian or gay or any of the other kind of diverse kind of personalities? So, and I'm definitely a member, and you know, I seek to learn and aspire to be an ally.
Beautiful. So I wanted to throw up this question that Molly Goldstein asked here. I know that Molly is responsible for the integration of people from an organization called Shekel, people who have, I think, either intellectual or physical disabilities, perhaps both, in Mobileye. And she asks, if an organization doesn't currently have ERGs and it's not coming from HR, it's not coming top down, how do you get the ball rolling? How do you move this forward? Molly, thanks.
That's a great question, Molly. And I mean, every organization is going to have its own personality, of course, or culture. And at Microsoft, I can give you an example of what happened. There were a group of people who were passionate about the challenges of being parents. And they got together and they started their own community, their own kind of events, their own, I believe they even have a WhatsApp group. And it slowly gained momentum and notice from management, who are now committed to starting a family employee resource group. That's an easy answer, because at Microsoft, the structure is sort of in place for this diverse, inclusive organizational patterns. I think that even if it's not coming from top down, a bottoms up approach can be incredibly successful, because the people who are going to be part of those communities are going to be people who are committed to it. And if those people are evangelizing the message and bringing it around and talking about the importance of it, it gets recognized and it will affect change in any organization.
Beautiful. So I love super practical. People start a WhatsApp group, and eventually activity will be noticed. We also have a comment from a wonderful friend and colleague of mine, Yael, who is speaks with very clear and practical advice about how to make people who have physical disabilities comfortable in your space, and super practical. Door handles, carpet, lighting. She's really practical. So, Yael, I'm so glad you were able to join us today. Can I trust people will be responsive to my requests? Beautiful. Yael, thank you.
You know, I'm finding that certainly in Microsoft, it just happens. And certainly I would invite you to, Helen, in the future, to talk to the woman who leads the disability employee resource group at Microsoft. It cuts across both, as you mentioned, the physical and the neurodiverse divide. I don't know if it's called a divide, but across that spectrum. So it's definitely something that's built into our culture at Microsoft. I don't know what to say. All I can say is that I'm hopeful, because I'm seeing it more and more recognized in Israeli society. We see it in the military. We see it in the workspace. And the more it's becoming de rigueur, it's going to become expected from everyone. Maybe I wear rose-tinted glasses, and maybe it's just me being hopeful. But if you don't believe, then it won't come true.
Well, I think that there is real change happening. We also see it in terms of newspaper headlines, mainstream media giving increased recognition to cases of harassment and abuse, and also firsts like the subject of breaking glass in all sorts of ways has increasingly become something that is newspaper headline worthy. So I do think that we're seeing change. I think that we're seeing, Me Too triggered something. I think we're seeing change in all sorts of deep ways. And is there more work to do? Yeah, there's more work to do. But the ball is rolling. Adina, what else should I ask you? What else would you like people to know about what Microsoft is doing around inclusion, how else they can enact the value of inclusion? And I'm on LinkedIn, so actually I'm going to leapfrog and go to the third part of that question, which is how does this benefit an organization like Microsoft? You can hire anybody, why would anybody have this as a value in terms of the business model? Why?
So even before the business model, our leader, Satya Nadella, and the Chief Diversity Officer, Lindsay Ray McIntyre, talk about the values that we bring to the corporation. People today, and any of us can read this, the varying studies about this, are interested not just in making a dollar or doing incredibly interesting technological work. We are also interested in making a difference, in making this a better world. And if a company wants to attract those kinds of people, and I can't imagine a company wouldn't, then they have to make this, kind of a part of what they're offering. We saw people from around the world at different global organizations who walked out of their offices when they felt their company wasn't acting appropriately. We've seen people from around the world and from many different organizations say, if you don't take a stance on this, we're out of here. And so there's just in terms of the impact on who your employee base is going to be, it's important. There's also, of course, that if you strive to serve a diverse, universal population of customers, if you don't have that in-house, you can't possibly hope to be successful at meeting everyone's needs. So there's that piece.
Beautiful. Will help you speak to the people you want to reach more effectively. Adina, is there something else that you would like to share as we move ahead?
Yeah, I really want to encourage everybody to read up on coaching and on allyship. Get to know your neighbors around you. I definitely encourage reading the Microsoft's Global Diversity and Equity and Inclusion Report. You can find it online. There's some great training that Microsoft has shared out as well around allyship and coaching. Look for that, as I said earlier. And please do feel free. I'd love to talk to you about how this has been successfully rolled out at Microsoft.
Amazing. Adina, what a wonderful offer. Free training materials online available from Microsoft for people who want to do inclusion better. And you're also making an offer for people to be in touch if they'd like to take the conversation further and learn more about how to do it, inclusion, get it off the wall and into the boardroom. I am so glad that we had this conversation today. Adina, thank you so much for carving the time out of your mad busy day, and we wish Sujud again a full and speedy recovery. May she be returned to full health, and perhaps join us next time on a conversation. Adina, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, everyone.